All right, it's finally here. Today we're talking about variants in Figma. All right, so variants are here, and it's super exciting because now we get to have multi-state components within Figma. They've gone a bit farther than your traditional expectations for multi-state components, and really have gone above and beyond to implement components that can closely mimic the structure of how they would exist in code. And I'll explain that as we dive into this, but variants are very powerful, a little bit complicated to kind of get going, but once you understand the concepts of them, they're really going to unlock a whole bunch of new potential for your designs, especially if you have design systems or components that you wish to have multiple properties for. So I've got a file here that Figma has released. I'm going to walk through it with you. We're going to go through this. We're going to build out some different variants. I'm going to explain some tips and tricks along the way, and we're going to learn a bunch of really exciting things about this new system. So let's dive in with what is variance. This is a new way of looking at components. Before, if you had maybe say a button, you would create multiple components like you can see here. This is the visual indicator that this object is a component with the purple outline and the purple diamonds. We can see we have multiple buttons, and then traditionally you would use those buttons and provide overrides to show different kinds of buttons in different contexts. Well, now you can group all of them together in what's called a variant, and then that variant gives you one single component with properties that you can use to set different states, different looks, and control how that component is rendered. This was done for a few different reasons. They didn't want to explore your traditional multi-state component where, hey, I can make a button and I can provide a hover, a focus, and a disabled state. Although this is a great way of handling that interaction. This was a way of trying to align how we design with how components get built in code. So if you haven't seen any kind of code before, this may not make a whole lot of sense, but this might be simple enough for you to grasp the idea. Right now we're looking at an HTML component. This is most likely React, and we can see that there's a few different kinds of properties being passed to this button component. We can see that they're using a button here, a button here, a button here, but they're different kinds of buttons. You can see that it's setting the type equal to primary, the size equal to large, and no icon, or in code terms, icon equals false. And this one is rendered as this object. Here's the same button component, but this time different properties, a small size, secondary type, still icon false, and it's rendered in a different visual context. That's how you would structure a multifunctional button in code. I've done it several times, and I've never built out, button primary, button secondary components. It's always a singular button component with properties that let the consumer of the button adjust how that is viewed on the canvas, or how that's actually shown in the application. So when we design these buttons, though, in the past we've had to approach this from button primary, button secondary kind of context. That's evident just by looking at this example here. We would have to structure our buttons like this, but that's not exactly how they would be built in code. So this variant system is a way for us to bring in different states to the components, create stateful components, but also create components that can support multiple kinds of properties. Like we saw here, I can turn an icon on and off. This button has one, this button doesn't. They're different colors, different sizes, and that's all configured through the same button component. So that's a big feature of variants, is to support this more closely linked code style to our design style. Now let's look at how we can take our older components and convert them into variants. It's thankfully very easy. So we can see they've provided us with this example tab bar. These are 3 separate components, and they already exist as components. You can notice that down here in the layers, or here on the canvas with the purple indicators. And so we could use this tab bar, and then we could go over to our component override, and we can pick which one we wanted to use, or we can create a variant out of this. You'll notice that the sidebar on the right is growing out more and more as time goes on. This is where a lot of new features are, like auto layout. You also will find variants here. So to create a variant, we just select multiple components. Then there'll be a button that lets us combine them as a variant. We press that, and right away, the layout on the canvas has changed. We see there's no longer titles above each one of the components. Now it's a singular component with a purple dotted outline around this whole area. You'll also notice there's a couple of different things here now under the variants section. We no longer have that button to combine, but now we have a property and some items here. What does that mean exactly? Well, this is the properties that you would see in your code component. This is when you say, hey, I want type equal primary. Well, type is the property and primary is the value. So on our design side of things, we can adjust the property names within the variants to match what that would be in code. So in this example, I'll just call this section. I can rename that, and whenever I use this component, that is the title that I will see shown under my variants ability. These little pills right here represent which available options I have under the section property here. So if we go ahead and we drag and drop this tab bar right here, we'll notice that underneath the variant section, there's a title called section, and there's a drop down that I can pick. And those are the three pills that we saw earlier. And as I change them, the component state updates as well. So right now, it kind of just seems like a fancy way of doing component overrides that we already had before. You know, I can click tab bar and I can find different components here to change. Only this time they all live under a singular component, which already is very powerful just in its own right. It's a good way of organizing things, but that's not all that it does. Let's look at a more real-world example of variants and how you would use them. Button is a great way of looking at how variants can support lots of different states and different options, and how you want to maybe organize that on the canvas. So here there's a set of existing buttons that are all pre-made components. I can just select all of those, hit combine as variants, and then I can see it's created three different properties. Now I haven't talked about how these properties are created, but let's go ahead and do that. If I undo that, I can see the names of these components. Now, if you've used Figma or design tools in the past, you might be familiar with this idea of using slashes to delineate categories or like a folder structure for a component. The same idea applies here, only this time the order and the style really matters for how the variant gets created. The first section within a title becomes what the component is called. Every subsequent section after that is a property. If you lay your components out as you see on screen in this sort of 2D array style, row and columns, this is a not required, but this lets you organize and structure your components in a way that's easy to work with and add new properties to. So what do I mean? Well, the button has a primary with an icon, secondary, and then, secondary with icon as well. But there's also different states: default, hover, focus, disabled. You need to be able to manage each one of these individually. So if you approach it by having your states kind of act as a like an Excel spreadsheet or a 2D array where I keep all my primary buttons together and then I do my states vertically, then I can organize the content of these components in a way that is easy for me to manage as a designer, but also it helps the variant system know which properties to use. So each section in the name following a slash creates a new property, and then it groups all those up where appropriate. It also is aware of the order. So if I have a primary / disabled, and then I also have a secondary / disabled, then it knows which button to grab as I change the different properties. So let me go ahead and show you that in action. So I'm going to group all these up, combine as a variant. Let me go ahead and rename this. I'm going to call this type. You can just double click to rename. I'll rename this to the state, and I'll rename this to icon. And now if I go and drag that button out, now it's just a singular button. But if I adjust these settings in the variants, I can change the state to disabled, like I mentioned. All right, so now it is currently type primary. So it's right here in this row. I know it's gonna be one of these, and it is state disabled, and it has no icon. So that's how I know it's primary, no icon. And then I can look through these and I can find disabled. So that's how I can find out the row and the column for this. If I change the type to secondary, now it's going to search for the first item here, which is type. It's going to find secondary, and then it's going to look for the state, and we can see it's disabled, and then it's going to check for the icon without icon, which keeps it in the same spot in this area. And that is how we have to sort of structure our components to organize them, but also so that we can support these configurable states, because I can do with icon, bring it back to primary, change it to hover, and all of those different options exist. Now you can imagine the more configurations you add to this, the more properties you add, the more you have to design. You know, if I added, say, a clicked state, I have to design that clicked state for each one of these properties. Primary with icon, secondary. I have to support each one of those. So as this list grows, you can imagine it becomes kind of an exponential amount of components to design. But if you organize it on the canvas in this way of kind of keeping your rows and your columns very cleanly organized, then you can manage that in a very reusable way. Also, make one cool little note here about how the variant sidebar system works. You know, right now you've seen these drop downs, but if you notice, icon just has two options, with and without icon. So we kind of can think about, well, maybe that should just be a checkbox, like yes, no to the icon. Well, to add that, if we just change the property type from being named, which makes Figma think this is a drop down, to saying something like false and true. I guess actually this should be false and this should be true. Let me undo that. True, here we go. True and false. You also, I think you can do 0 and 1, any sort of Boolean statement here. And then I will drag this around, so that way whichever one's first will be your default option, and I can move these around to adjust the order in which they appear in the dropdown, or the order in which the checkbox operates. Now if I go back to my actual child button, I can see that icon is turned on and turned off, and it's just a checkbox, which is a more accurate to how I would actually be using this for a yes, no kind of scenario. So you can already see how powerful it is so you already can see how useful it is to create variants and utilize them for organization and maintaining complex components. But you also can see how easy it is to take our existing systems that we've already built with multiple components and convert them to variants. But let's talk about how we can create variants from scratch. As we move forward in this system, we don't need to create individual master components for each state and then group them all together and press combine as component or combine as variant. We can just create variants from scratch. So this is just a regular frame. Let's make it a component. Right click, create component. Boom. Now I've got a little banner. Nothing fancy here. But now I want to make a variant. So just like adding auto layout or layout grid or any kind of other thing to an object, I can come over to variants and press plus, and it's going to add a variant. And then I can name what this variant's called. Maybe I can name this one info. So I know that this one is selected as info. I can change the color, make that blue, make the outline blue. And now I have an info banner. And if I want to make sure to guide the consumer of this component to know what they're changing, I want to change the property name to maybe, let's just say, type. And then I can rename the default as well. I can select default down here, and I can rename this to error. And now I can notice that the names have changed in the layer panel, as well as changing in these pills. And now if I were to use this banner, I could drag this banner right here. And I'll notice that I have the ability under type to select which kind of component that I want. And it's just that easy. If you wish to add more properties, you just select the component again, go to variant, and I can add a new variant and I can add a new property. Adding a new variant will add a variant under the existing type. You know, this one could be success. I could change this to green, and I can see that now it's listed under type. If I want to add a new property, which acts as this sort of organizational category, I can do that down here, and I can name this to, icon. And then I would have to create variants that were organized for this icon. You'll notice now if you select I'm going to call it an inner component, there is two options here. Before we could rename, info to information, and that would change this pill, right? Error, information, success. Cool. So I know that the type is changing, but the icon hasn't changed. And you notice in the layer panel that the title also changed. Now it's information, error, success, but now there's this default listed here in the names. Well, the names represent the sort of key value pair of property to value. So if I want to add another, property to this property, I can rename either default to something else, or I can add a new one, and I could say true. And this one would be named true, and maybe this one could be named false. So now I just have true, false, and if I look under here, I can see that I've got three types and two icon representations, and this is how they would grab them. You still need to make each version of the variant property system. So if you're going to have two properties for icons, three properties for types, every type has to have both icons. So I have to make a true and false. That way I can actually use it for real in the real world, when I'm actually using this component. But for simple components, it's pretty easy just to add variants and then keep adding more variants and renaming them and adding new colors, and they'll show up in the override panel, and it'll be all nice and dandy and easy to use. You can notice, though, if I just keep adding things vertically, it'd be hard to see the organization, and that's why I mentioned it is really important to add these components in this sort of 2D array, Excel spreadsheet, left to right, top to bottom approach. That way I can keep track of, hey, here's all my states, here are all my kind of categories, and that's how I can make sure that I have every version that needs to exist for each state and each property type. This is how I can keep track of all of that. So I'll also mention here, a big part of why the variant system exists is because we're aligning our designs to how code actually is structured in the real world. We don't build a button from multiple components. A button is one component with multiple states. So to help support that, there's some improved inspecting of components in general, as well as variants. So if I select this variant and go over to the inspection tab, I can see that there's some information on the variant information. And if I copy this, it gets copied as you would see typical React or HTML props, where it takes the left value, adds an equal, and puts a string wrapper around the type. And that makes it easier to copy and paste it. Also makes it just easier to see what's going on. There's also been some adjustments to just components in general. You don't see that as much here, but there's an expansion on how much information is shown in the inspection tab. So if you use code handoff, this would be a huge kind of efficiency boost for you, as well as just a nice way of kind of handing off information to developers. And finally, there's a few different examples that Figma's provided for how we can use this system. This is a nice way of just creating multiple avatars and also showing some batch renaming things. I find this one very useful to be aware of, and that is nesting variants. So this is a simple variant of just 4 different kinds of notes, but within these notes, there is a component called a little voting dot. You can see them right here. Well, these dots are components, and because components can be variants, these dots are variants. So if I was to go and get a sticky note, I can select what kind of sticky note it is. So say I make it green, and then I can come within the sticky note and select 2 dots and turn on their checked state. An even cooler thing is if I change the kind of component this is, or I change the variant from green to red, the overrides stay the same as well, which is super useful and really powerful. I can't overstate how useful it is to be able to nest variants, have all that stay up to date and matched. You'll be able to create super complex design systems that are very easy to consume using this kind of nesting situation. It's going to be really awesome. They also showed a little example of using different styles. I can select this and change the platform. This is mostly just a visual thing. There's nothing different from this to what we've already seen in the button example. But this just goes to show that your components within this can be anything you want. They don't have to just be overrides of the same component. They can be wildly different things. In fact, we can notice that here. I can select between a phone and a tablet, and it's just a whole different component. But all of this is contained within one menu variant system. So it's really easy to create grouped content, grouped categories, and not just have to think about one singular component with various override states. I can really think about how I want to organize my design system, how components maybe react to different breakpoints. You know, I would have a different mobile navigation versus a tablet navigation. This is a great way to organize those since they both exist as a singular navigation system. This is just really powerful and something to remember as we utilize this system and learn more of its intricacies moving forward. All right, well, that is kind of an overview of variants. Thanks for hanging with me. I know it was a longer video than usual. If you have more questions, I'd be happy to talk with you or to provide you to the right person to answer that question. I know Figma has a bunch of other resources out right now as well. I'll even put a link to this file that I was using in the description if you want to play with this kind of playground example of variants. I think the best advice I can give you is to just dive in and start experimenting with them. I think once you get the hang of how I can structure variants within that 2D layout with sort of the left to right, top to bottom approach to really organize stuff, you'll just be running with this system, and it's going to open up so many different possibilities and doors for us. I know there was talk at the last big conference to allow prototyping to support changing variants based on different states. I don't believe that's implemented currently, but I do know that is something on their radar. So that will allow you to, say, change a button to like a hover state on an actual mouse hover and do it contextually on the component and not on the frame level. So there's still more to come, so stay tuned for that. It's gonna be really exciting. And that's it. I hope y'all can dive in and make some cool things with it. Until next time, I'm Max.